Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Project Octane. We're sort of in between build days this week. If you saw last week's episode, then you know that we have the front and rear thirds mostly welded together, which mostly leaves just the center cockpit, which we'll start to tackle in next week's video, which is build day 3. Some of y'all also might remember back in episode 10, we designed the shock mounts for the frame, and that's something we're also going to tackle with the next couple of build days. Now before we get around to actually welding all those parts on the frame, I wanted to take the opportunity to show you a little bit of the prep work, call it the build day 2.5, that goes on in between these weeks. So we're going to start back with the cockpit tubes. There's several bent tubes that make up the cage around the driver. Just like the regular straight round tubes, we went ahead and used paper templates. We had a bit of an issue where each of these 6 tubes were about 2 to 3 degrees under bent what they should have been, and that kind of threw off our templates. So this is actually the second set, but you can see here that it's obviously a lot closer and it follows the lines almost exactly. We don't have to cut out the entire tubing template. The last 2 or 3 inches on each end is really just what we're looking for. Once that's done, we can get the angle grinder back out and we can rough cut both ends of the tube. There's also a couple other smaller round tubing that's used as part of the shock mounts that we're going to go ahead and cut at this time as well. Once we have everything rough cut, we can go ahead and take off the cutting wheel and put on a sanding disc. That'll pretty much finish the tubes off. If needed, we'll take a hand file and kind of hit any rough spots or bumps or anything that we might have missed. Jumping back to the shock mounts, we also use paper templates for these. As you can see, it's a much larger diameter tube. It's actually a 7.5 inch outer diameter with a 1/4 inch wall. I actually didn't want nearly as thick a tube to begin with, but it was really the only option that was readily available for us. Once the template's been taped in place, I used Sharpie just to trace the outer profile. This just gives me a reference in case the paper comes off at any point. Each of these tubes also has 2 holes where the upper control arm also mounts on the inside. And so it's a good idea, while the paper is nice and clean and we can see exactly where the center is, to go ahead and punch it and pilot drill it. We'll open that hole up with a couple of larger drill bits until we're ready to actually use our hole saw to finish it off. If you remember in last week's video, I talked about making a mistake with the hole saw not being drilled on center, and at the time we were using what I would say is a fairly cheap hole saw that I wouldn't say is really meant for heavy duty steel. And so here I actually have a carbide tipped hole saw that absolutely eats through this, even with it being as thick as it is. Made my life a whole heck of a lot easier, and I really wish I had had it a couple weeks ago. The process still took a good while to actually do all 8 holes on the 4 different shock mounts. And every once in a while I'd apply a little bit of thread cutting lubricant just to help out some. All of this happened over the course of several days and a couple of weekends, so it kind of goes back and forth. Not everything was done sequentially where all holes were drilled and then all mounts were cut from the raw stock tubing, so we'll go back and forth a little bit for the rest of this video. But at least here you can see we split one of the shock mounts off of this tube here. There's also a bit of an additional cutout that gets made that gives us a little bit of clearance in the front to avoid the body of the Octane. And we'll just keep working through these tubes and cutting off each shock mount as we get there. Just like the cockpit tubing, we're going to go ahead and finish off each of these shock mounts using the flap disc. Basically sanding it the rest of the way back down to the Sharpie line that we marked earlier. Before we can call it good, we've got to go back to the holes. When I'm using the hole saw, I'm cutting tangent to the surface of the tube, so it's in line with the center of the hole. However, the tube that actually passes through and connects the two holes is not through the center of the shock mount, and so we have to finish the mount hole by aligning it to the hole across from it. It's pretty much just involved taking a couple hours with a hand file with some sexually suggestive motions and eventually getting the tubing to fit correctly. You can see that it only really happens when the tube, or at least the two sections of the tube that I'm using here, align concentrically. So that's all we got for today. Like I said, a little bit of a filler, but next week we'll have build day 3, where we actually take all these items and start to weld them to the frame, and man, we're just a couple of days from being able to bring this home. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you about the same time next week.